Welcome everyone, my name is Adam and I spent months researching music for racing games. And let me tell you, it was an interesting experiment. Today I'm here to present a few other cases of soundtrack in games. But I have to tell you that I do not know anything about music. Just like most of us, I've sat through the music classes in primary school and we actually had lessons in high school as well related to music, but I cannot tell you anything about music, like why certain things work for the way they work and how to write a score or anything like that. What I can tell you is that I'm someone who spent a lot of time, both in past term and in present as well, racing in games. I spent time in a lot of games actually. Since I was a kid, I was really into racing games, and you get the point. I've listened to a lot of music in my past as well, and I'm still listening to a lot of songs. And while I mostly listen to one kind of genre in these days, I'm open to a lot of things. But I still have one question in my mind when it comes to racing games, and that is why they choose the songs for the games that they choose. When it comes to an arcade game, for example Need for Speed, why does Need for Speed Payback has such a weird soundtrack? Like, why does it not fit? Why can't they select something that would fit into the theme of the game? Like, you have this big area which very much looks like Las Vegas, yet you do not have any songs that would fit into that area. When it comes to the 2015 Need for Speed, you have a lot of songs that would someone listen to in a party or something like that, so that fits. You have a lot of EDM songs in the game, and you have very much a good song variety there. Like, for some reason you have a German rap song in it that I absolutely adore. Arcade games usually go for more of a, let's put it like this, they usually prefer the licensed soundtrack. You have a lot of licensed songs like pop songs or rock songs, sometimes a bit of a rap, and it's more about the time that the game is set in. For example, Need for Speed Most Wanted has a lot of awful rock songs in it that I do not like at all. For example, I Am Rock is awful, I think, but that fits into the current time of the game, so it gets a pass for me. When it comes to composed soundtracks, however, Need for Speed has a lot of that as well. For example, the 2010 Hot Pursuit game has one of the best chase songs ever produced. It's very epic, it fits the action very much so, and I love it to my heart. But that's not my favorite from the series. My favorite composed soundtrack within the series comes from Need for Speed Carbon. Not the police chase songs, but the themes themselves. What do I mean by that? You have a theme song for muscle cars, tuner cars, and exotics as well. And that is not a stretch. All of them sound different, yet there's one bass theme throughout the entire game. And sometimes the police chase theme song combine with the race themes as well. Need for Speed Carbon, I guess, if I think about it, is the only game where the licensed soundtrack is in the background and not in the spotlight. And still to this day, I pretty much love that game for the soundtrack, not alone for the soundtrack, but that's one of the reasons I love it. But that's something that I can't say for other games. For example, Need for Speed is most of arcade racing, like I mentioned, but there were attempts to make it more of a sim game. For example, there were the Need for Speed Shift and Shift 2 games, which were pretty much mixed when it comes to public reviews and stuff like that. But there were one interesting thing about Need for Speed Shift 2 Unleashed. That's a long name, no wonder they just use it Shift 2 Unleashed. The game had licensed soundtrack, however the way the game portrayed it was a bit different. For example, there were not many songs in the game, but all of the songs had 3 different versions. For example, you had Hollywood Undead, Levitate in 3 different versions. You had one for the menus, which fitted so perfectly that even while I'm talking about it, I get goosebumps from it. And these different versions would also appear in replays as well, or when you finish a race. Is it a good move? Not really when you only have just a few songs in the game, but is it something unique? Yes, it is. It is very much so unique. Unfortunately, that's all Shift 2 had to offer when it comes to music. You had your menu songs, and that's all really. Outside of these 2 things that I mentioned, there were no songs for the races itself, and it was most of a letdown. The Shift games were produced by Slightly Mad Studios, which at the time of this recording was announced to be bought by or acquired by Codemasters. Before this happened, they made Project Cars 1 and 2, and these games also have their soundtracks, but in the case of Project Cars 2, these soundtracks only appears in the menus, and it's more about giving you a certain vibe, like making you remember drivers that passed away and stuff like that. And if you're like a veteran racer and stuff like that, or like really know who these mentioned drivers are and stuff like that, for example Ayrton Senna and what like that, you will appreciate this. But at the same time, if you're someone who has no clue about these people, this soundtrack will not do anything for you. It doesn't really connect to the game, in my opinion. It doesn't give out any sign of possible nostalgia, in my opinion. Since I mentioned Codemasters and nostalgia, let's talk about F1. Now, Codemasters has had since 2010 does this Formula 1 official game series, which is something that I jumped into in 2017. That would be a bit of a stretch. I did have the game. No, when did I buy it? In 2018, 2019? I don't even know. So let's say that this year I bought 2019, and I was a bit interested about this game's soundtracks. For example, 2018 and 19 uses the official theme of F1. But once you go back to the earlier days, for example 2010, 11, 12 and 13, these games have an evolution of a theme song which was produced by Ian Livingstone. Ian Livingstone was one of those composers who worked with Codemasters for games like the mentioned F1 titles and also the Grid games, the first 3. All 3 Grid games have a different theme song, 2 being my favorite, to be honest. But when it comes to F1, Ian was doing the soundtrack from 2010 to 2014, I think. Again, a huge shout out goes out right now to nfssoundtracks.com because without that website I wouldn't know much of the things that I'm talking about right now. So go check out that site if you like soundtracks and games. But what's interesting about the F1 team in the Codemaster games is from 11 to 13 there's one theme that's reoccurring in both games, all three games. That theme song is so iconic that still to this day when someone creates gameplay of the current F1 games or like earlier games, they still use that song. For example, you can just search it up. I wanted to say out the name of the guy, but I keep forgetting how to pronounce it. But there you go on the screen, it's presented. Pretty much if you just search up F1 career mode, you will find his channel, Benjamin's channel. It's quite good. I quite enjoy the content he produced. But the point is, here he is still using the soundtrack for his career mode from 2012 to the current games like 2018, 2019. That soundtrack is that iconic that it's still present in the community that once loved it and still loves it. But what happened in 2014? The game got a different soundtrack from the same author. Well, in 2014, F1 changed from V8 to V6, and they thought that a new soundtrack with a different theme would fit the new era as well. However, things changed quickly because in 2015, Ian was nowhere near in Codemasters. We got a new sound composer who produced not just 2015's soundtrack for the game, but also for 2016 and 17. For these 3 years, we had a different theme for the game, one that was pretty much more of an acoustic feel. Not like what am I talking about? Not like acoustic, but more like a chill out, relax, live in the moment kind of style, which I guess sounded also futuristic. And I'm not saying that it was bad. It was pretty much different. And that style is still present in the current Formula 1 games as well, but not anymore from the same author again. Because in 2018, Brian Tyler happened. And with that, we got the official F1 theme song in the official F1 game as well. Do I like this change? It's a double-edged sword. On one end, it delivers the same message across the board, but at the same time I feel like that it kills the uniqueness of the soundtrack that we had before. For example, in 2018, not just Brian Tyler happened, but Codemasters also hired a new composer as well. So we had in this past 9 or 10 years, 3 different composers for the F1 titles, if you do not count Brian Tyler's main theme, of course. If you think this is a bit of a stretch to have 3 different authors or composers for the same thing that barely changes yearly, then let me introduce you to Forza Motorsport. Look at that freaking lens, man. That shit is immersive. A series where all of the soundtracks sound very much different with every interpretation? No, what is
installment?
Anyway, with each new Forza game, the soundtrack not just changed with style, but with theme as well. And you cannot really find any reoccurring themes in this series. Forza 3 sounds different than Forza 4, Forza 4 sounds different than Forza 5, 5 sounds different than 6, 6 sounds different than 7. From all of these soundtracks, 6 is my favorite because it sounds epic, it fits very much into the action, and also Forza 6 is the only game that I can actually play on Windows 10 because it has a free demo version. Yeah, and you cannot buy Forza 6 anymore, or any of the previous titles for that. But what happened with Forza 7? If Forza 6 was a huge epic when it comes to soundtrack, what happened with Forza 7? Well, Forza 7 sounds like your average car commercial, and it's not the stretch. You might think that because they changed the composers for the game, but no. actually, surprisingly, Forza 7 has the same composers as Forza 6. So what happened there? I'm not sure, but it doesn't really add to the game itself. Forza 6 has a very good soundtrack that not just plays in the menus, but it also plays during races as well. And it's something that accompanies the races. It's something that adds to the action or creates the action. In some cases, a soundtrack can enhance your driving, and that's something that not just made up. Sometimes it can also give you the edge that you want for something, but sometimes it can also work against you as well.
Car right, watch your right, hold your line, clear right, on your right, 3 wide, keep right, left side, still there, clear left, okay, your brake temperature is spot on. Left side, clear left. Car left. All clear, all clear.
Since I mentioned epicness, you would think that sim racing is full of epic soundtracks because the racing itself is more about achieving real driving and stuff like that, or simulating the situations and stuff like that. So you would think that, for example, the WRC games or Dirt or anything like that would have a huge soundtrack to them to accompany the action. And I have to disappoint you, but that's not the case. If anything, sim racing games usually do not have any type of songs. Assetto Corsa being the prime example here, where there's no soundtracks whatsoever throughout the entire game. And there are people out there who are actually working against this. For example, Assetto Corsa has one mod which allows you to have soundtrack appearing in different stages of the race. For example, there's suspense, there's overtake, there's failure, or there's win. And this is the format that's been used throughout other games as well from time to time. For example, other games like GT Legends usually use the soundtrack or the end of the race or for the menus and whatnot. But you can also enable the music to play whenever you want it. Again, this might work for you or might work against you. In a case of, for example, a game that's not meant to be a racing game, but a lot of people use it like that, so I'm gonna include it as well, and I have serious history with this, so just let me talk a bit, sorry. Grand Theft Auto 5 is one of the cases where our music totally works against racing. When you create a track, you can either enable a background music for the job or not, but that soundtrack is so bland, so boring, so not fitting to racing that it usually turns people against it. However, once someone finishes the race, there's a certain soundtrack that starts to play if you have the music still turned on in the game, and that is a 30-second rundown once someone finishes the race. But why doesn't soundtrack, a composed soundtrack, appears more in racing games? Or when it does, why does most of them sound so generic? Like, for example, why does the soundtrack in Need for Speed Drivers, just the chase soundtrack, sound so much worse or so underdeveloped when you compare it to something that's been produced 3 years ago from the same composer? I guess it sometimes comes down to creating something new or just not having enough time for something. For example, the so mentioned Need for Speed series, I'm coming back to this a lot actually, being known to produce games once a year, similar to Call of Duty. So one time you would have a game that would have a huge epic soundtrack produced by Brian Tyler, while also having totally different version of the same game with a totally different story and soundtrack which was produced by Mick Gordon. While at the same time you would have a totally different game as well, which was Need for Speed Shift, all in the same time. At the end of the day, it's hard to tell when a soundtrack will be good for a game or not. It very much is a gamble if you look at it that way. I appreciate when I hear a good soundtrack, but I also accept bad soundtracks as well. Like, I'm not hating on composers and authors and all of these things, but because there's also, of course, there's time put into these projects. And just like how sideways we're talking about multiplayer soundtracks for games, soundtracks for racing games are also something that's hard to do right.
Okay, so before we get into this, I want you to all do something for me. Pause this video and head to Twitch, and see if you can find someone streaming a competitive video game that isn't muting the game and playing their own music over it. See, this is kind of a big problem for music in video games. So if your game has a solo campaign, you can almost copy and paste all the same musical material over to the multiplayer side of things. But with these newer games that have no offline single-player story, all the music you write has to function around what the players are doing instead of more rigid cues and checkpoints. So how do you deal with this mess? The truth is, nobody really knows, but everybody's taking a shot at it.
And when that happens, it can create not only nostalgia, but something completely new as well. Who knows? There might be a very good sim racing game in the future with a huge epic soundtrack. Or there might be a new Burnout-styled soundtrack for games as well. But what I see currently is that composed soundtrack is much more rare and a lot less unique in these days. In the case of official games, for example, F1 and VRC, soundtracks aren't in the spotlight anymore. They are somewhat in the background, and they put the official soundtrack, like the official theme of the sport, in the spotlight. When I look at Need for Speed, I do not see a huge integration with the theme song and the chase music mixed together like back in 2006 when Carbon was made. But I also see good attempts here and there. Having a good soundtrack in a game that has two different versions and both of them sound pretty good is something that I can also appreciate and I adore. Like, my hat is off to you guys for having two completely different soundtracks for the same game on two different consoles. And yeah, for those who don't know, I'm talking about the Run Now. One that was a huge risk at the time, and for many it was a failure. In the case of sim games, music is something that they are not focusing on, and that's why I'm interested to see what will happen with Slightly Mad, since now they are part of Codemasters. Will they have a big enough budget to hire composers for the game, or they will have just a few licensed soundtracks, licensed songs in the game and just call it a day? I'm gonna sit here and I'm gonna listen. I want to hear good stuff in games, and I hope that there will be many in the future. I have a question for you guys, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm working on a video and I'm looking for perspectives. So
Voice actors.
No. I'm just asking around, so I get the perspective of other people on the subject. So I assume that some of you played racing games here and there.
Yes. I mean, we were playing Forza Horizon 4
Yeah.
nights ago.
And I have a like, I'm working on a video about soundtracks for racing games, like how they changed and how it's just licensed music these days. And I want to ask you guys if you can name a racing game that you would actually listen to the soundtrack, like not the licensed
Midnight Maximum 2 and 5.
Like not the licensed music, but like the actual soundtrack that's composed to the game.
You see, the only racing game that had good soundtracks that I liked were the fucking NASCAR games, because it was literally just what was played on the local radio, and Flat Out, where they only had one song done for them. I think it was done for them.
I can't remember the exact name of the game, so I'd have to go back and look. But there was a PlayStation 2 game about like it's freaking like ships and stuff that would like float.
F-Zero?
No, it's like
No, it was like
stuff.
hypersonic and stuff or something.
If one of y'all want to re-barricade this
Was it
after
fucking?
we
Was it
run out,
fucking sun?
You
was
could
it,
create like
was it fucking
floating
Sonic Red?
racetracks and stuff. I'd go back and look at the name, but
guys. Or actually, wait, no. If one of you want to just stand there, and I can let you know when to run out.
Yeah, one gun midnight.